Tea Time with Chester and What's Left of Angelo by Tara Summerville. Narrated by William Skye. This story is from the first edition of the Keystone Codex, a new innovative project about highlighting the best independent sci-fi authors around. Tara Summerville is one such author. You can get your copy of Rubber City Ruins and its sequel, Escaping the Ruins, on Kindle or paperback from the link in the description. So if you enjoy this story by Tara, definitely go check those novels out. And while you're at it, get your free copy of the Keystone Codex in EPUB or PDF form. There's a link to that in the description too. But now let's get to the story. Chester plucked a pair of chipped but clean porcelain teacups from the cabinets. They were white with delicate purple flowers and stained tea rings, which no amount of scrubbing could eliminate. He placed the two teacups on their matching saucers on the table, with the bowl of sugar teeming with ants, and a mustard yellow vase with an assortment of aster he had picked that morning. He looked over at Angelo, who was sitting on the bench near an open window, gently bobbing his head. The August breeze from the window was warm and sticky, and swirled through Angelo's few remaining tufts of hair. Chester leaned down next to the fireplace, listening for bubbles in the tea kettle. The fire probably made the room feel unbearably warm on that humid August day, if Chester could still feel warmth. Not ready quite yet, Chester thought, and idly paced the small cabin with his arms folded tightly around his chest. He stopped for a moment to admire his hand-drawn calendar nailed to the wall next to the kitchen sink. August 30th, 2226, it read, below his drawing of two cats sitting on a tree stump. He never got the pause quite right, he lamented. But he gave himself a pass. It had been well over 150 years since he had seen a cat grace their secluded lakeside retreat. As Chester picked up one of the teacups, debating whether he should continue to try and clean the stains on the inside of its delicate porcelain, there was a gentle knock on the door. He looked over at Angelo, and Angelo looked at the door. They stared in stark silence for a moment, frozen in unease. Then there was another knock, a little more confident this time. Angelo shuffled to his feet, ran into the bedroom, and slammed the door behind him. The sound must have rattled the visitor, who whispered in a quivering voice, "Is anyone in there?" Without hesitation, Chester wrapped himself in a threadbare bathrobe and slid an old Halloween mask over his head. He smoothed a floppy fishing hat with lures and bobbers on top of the mask, tucked his long hair into the collar of his robe, and placed his hand on the doorknob. It had been nearly a century since he and Angelo had visitors, and back then no one had bothered with knocking. Chester could still smell how their tiki torches, the repurposed citronella patio candles on long wicker poles, made the air smell sweet like lemons. The crowd collected on his lawn like gnats, trampling through his budding rose garden and spitting in the soil. Their torches bobbed in syncopated rhythm, howling for their blood like it would somehow fix the world. Eventually, the screaming mobs faded. Distant gunshots gave way to the soft trill of yellow warblers and rattling cicadas. Silence, sweet yet unnatural, settled over the homestead like thick moss. Those memories, washed away from the weight of decades, sent something cold crawling once again down Chester's mechanical spine. Yet he opened the door anyway. Before him stood a girl somewhere in her teens, with a frail frame, wearing a dusty knit beanie, a navy blue jumpsuit, and a comically large pack slung over one shoulder, nearly crushing her. Her eyes grew wide as she looked up at Chester. She nervously shifted her weight on the soft, termite-infested wooden floorboards, clearly considering running away. "Hello there, little lady," Chester smiled under his mask. Despite his frightening appearance, his tone was light. It was soft and kind, and the small girl's frozen stance softened. When she didn't respond to his pleasantry, he added, "Are you in trouble?" I'm all alone," the girl said into her shoes, afraid to look up at the stranger. Yes, it is lonely out there." Chester hadn't spoken to another human other than Angelo in so long, and he was rather rusty. Conversations with Angelo were often one-sided, with Chester carrying the bulk of the conversational load. He searched for more words to bridge the silence, but they never came. So they stood there in an uncomfortable stalemate, overshadowed by the chatty toads in the nearby lake. "Do you want to come inside?" he finally asked. The girl shifted in her shoes, peering past Chester into the home, brightly lit by the open windows. Okay," she said, looking over her shoulder. Chester gleefully swung the door open and stepped aside. "Excellent," he said, a little too enthusiastically, like the old witch in Hansel and Gretel. Clearly the young girl did not know the old cautionary tale and casually walked inside. She made it to the welcome mat and plopped her pack down next to the wooden rocking chair. She unzipped her jumpsuit halfway and politely smiled at Chester, who didn't quite know what to do with his arms. He crossed them, uncrossed them, rubbed them on the tops of his thighs, and ultimately settled on hanging them loosely at his sides like a decommissioned marionette. "I'm Helen," she said in a small voice, cautiously looking around the room that was decorated with odd knickknacks and fresh-cut flowers. "I'm Chester," he said warmly. "We haven't had a visitor here let's see." Chester reached to fiddle with the loose flap of skin on his chin, as he always did when deep in thought, but instead just rubbed the outside of his mask. "A very long time." "We?" Helen swallowed hard. "Angelo and I. Chester loosely pointed to the closed door in the back of the living room. "Ran to the bedroom to hide when he heard you at the door. Visitors make him nervous." Helen nodded slowly, not taking her eyes off the closed door. "There's no one out there. Did you know that there's no one out there?" "I'm well aware." Chester smiled under his mask. "I lived in a bunker, the Jefferson bunker," Helen said, like Chester would recognize the name and be impressed. Instead, he stared back at her blankly. "You know," Helen took a few more steps inside and plopped down on the old sofa. A plume of dust erupted from the seams as she sat. "It's hard to have a conversation with a mask." "I don't think you want me to take off this mask." "Sure I do," she said confidently. "I haven't talked to another person in months. I'd like to see your face." He slowly removed his mask and let the bathrobe fall to the floor, revealing his grass-stained denim overalls. Helen was face to face with a 200-year-old man, a failed science experiment, an amalgamation of flaking flesh and titanium bones and organs that powered what remained of his brain. He smiled sadly at her, well aware that the unforgiving passage of time had done no favors to the body that Gleason Laboratories had given him. Helen shuffled back on her feet, afraid to look directly at what was left of Chester's face. In the silence, she grabbed small, palatable peeks, and found that despite his ghastly appearance, his eyes were soft and kind. Who? Helen combed through her abbreviated vocabulary, looking for the best way to ask what was wrong with him. The answer to her jumbled question was complicated. Towards the end, when viruses and violence started to spiral, Gleason Laboratories tried their hand at immortality. It was a simple yet not uncommon tale. Chester was broke. They offered him a lot of money to become immortal, and he gladly agreed. They created a half-dead monster, abandoned the project, and set their test subjects loose on a society that felt their very existence spat in the face of God. Few survived the initial purge, but Chester and Angelo were two of the few who realized that isolation was their best chance at survival. They weren't going to change any minds, and there was no way to assimilate into society. So they lived off the map for a while, waiting out the slow collapse of what was left of civilization. The world tried their hands at immortality, and I was as close as they got, he eventually said. Angelo was one of the earlier trials. His body isn't holding up as well as mine, which is why he's hiding. We learned in school that the cowards left on rocket ships to distant planets, and the few brave souls stayed on Earth to live in bunkers until the Earth was habitable again. You learned that in the bunker? Chester asked with a raised eyebrow. She nodded firmly. Chester wasn't about to pull on that string. Would you like to stay for tea? It's just about ready. I can see if I can convince Angelo to join us. Helen nodded and slumped deeper into the plush sofa. It was clear to Chester that she was unsure about staying, but her frail body was unwilling to decline the invitation. As Chester carefully poured the stained brown liquid into each cup, Helen tried as hard as she could to stare at Angelo without actually staring at Angelo. He had the basic form of a man, but lacked the distinguishing features that made humans unique. There were small tufts of curly black hair peppered throughout his scalp, and a few bits of grey flesh that clung to exposed bones and dried tendons. Angelo tried to smile at her, but without lips it just made the withered muscles around his exposed teeth take on an unnerving shape. Angelo said to Helen. You don't know what you're talking about, Chester scoffed. The tea is very good. He looked at Helen and rolled his eyes. Angelo wanted you to know that my tea isn't good, but what does he know? Chester smiled playfully at Angelo. He doesn't have a tongue or any taste buds anymore. Oh, Helen laughed nervously. I'm just here for the company anyway. I've been away from home for months. So did you run away from home? Angelo seemed concerned. Yeah, they told us the world was on fire, but I wanted to see what it was like on the outside. So I left. And you know what? What? The world isn't on fire. It's really pretty. I've explored lakes and old cities, buildings that looked like they once reached all the way into the sky. I don't know what happened. Why did everyone go underground? Chester inhaled sharply before slapping Helen's hand away as she reached for the ant-infested sugar dish. The short version? People are terrible. It was an overdue mutual self-destruction. Angelo agreed. But you're human. Chester wavered. I was human. But I was willing to basically sell away my soul for $3,000. I think if your parents saw me, they would beg to differ. They'd be wrong. Helen shifted her focus to the window. It's so pretty here. I miss my family, but I don't want to go back home. She glanced down into her teacup, rocking gently in her seat to suppress the cough rising in her chest until it broke loose, a violent fit that splattered bright red patterns across the delicate china. Chester looked at Angelo with a knowing gaze, one that Angelo reciprocated. Maybe you can stay here with us for just a little while. Helen tried her best to wipe the blood from the table with her sleeve. That would be nice. For a little while, but then I want to go back home. Maybe I can convince my family to leave too. After tea, Chester found some old blankets and made Helen a makeshift bed on the sofa. As she lay down to rest, Chester and Angelo sat outside on the porch swing to watch the sunset, as they did every evening. I'd give her a couple of weeks. Chester's voice was uncharacteristically low. Angelo shrugged. Even if she makes it back to her bunker, they'll never let her back in. Angelo shook his head. We'll bury her under the willow over there. Chester nodded to the tree with the billowing branches that danced in the wind. Angelo laid his head on Chester's shoulder as the sky folded in on itself, bursting in brilliant shades of pink and orange. The last remaining bits of sunlight weaved through the reeds, casting long, tendril-like shadows on the porch. The world around them hummed, distant and indifferent. Angelo said, rubbing his cheek deeper into Chester's shoulder. I know, Chester said softly. I hate it here too. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the story, remember that Tara Summerville has written the novels Rubber City Ruins and Escape from the Ruins, among others. You can get your copies using the link in the description. And don't forget to pick up your copy of the Keystone Codex using the link below. I've narrated a couple of the stories included, but there are several more to discover. See you in the next one.